I want to call it like, I don't know.
I hate myself.
yeah, just like self-loathing. Yeah. How are you? How was the retreat last week?
It was good. First time I swam in Lake Erie.
Oh, nice.
So I was in Ohio on the south side of Lake Erie, just hanging out and getting drunk and skinny dipping in Lake Erie.
Nice, dude. Yeah, nothing too exciting on my end. Successfully potty trained, which is good.
Oh, I forgot. Yeah, nice. The 3-day sprint, it worked.
Yeah, the 3-day blitz. Now she's using the potty. So that's literally the most exciting thing that's happened in our nothing too exciting on my side.
Do you have to go with her, though? Yeah. Or she'll just self-sufficient?
No, so it's still like in the middle of the living room in this like plastic.
Oh, she has her own toilet.
Yeah, well, it's called a potty, Ben. It's not a toilet.
Here I was thinking potty was synonymous with the toilet, but alas, my whole life has been a lie.
No, a potty is like this plastic thing, and then she pees in it, and then you're like, yay, go Georgia. Oh, wow. And then she like walks over to the toilet and then like dumps the pee in the...
You make her clean her own
well, no, it's like, that's the reward for a job well done. And maybe like we wouldn't want to deny her the pleasure of pouring her own urine into the toilet and flushing it down. Exactly. Because that's what the big girls do, right? She's not a little baby anymore. But yeah, that's basically been the most exciting thing. That's what we did last week.
Wow. Preparing her for her future glamorous career as a porta potty
technician.
Technician, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's funny.
Yeah, here's a question for you. If given the choice, would you keep your interests exactly as they are? So you have your sort of interests, and you're just, for instance, you're interested in certain fields, certain technical subjects, computer science and philosophy and stuff. But then there's this meta question of, do I want those things to be my interests? Like, would I change my interests if I could change my interests?
Yeah,
basically. And I'm curious if you ever feel like you would change your interests, or like, especially when it came to work or a job, do you wish you were more interested in one subject over another, or more interested in doing certain sorts of tasks than you are, or something like that?
Have we never talked about this before?
I don't think so.
It's not that I would. It's that I did. I made it. This is like one of my first projects. I don't know if we've ever talked about this. This is so interesting. So yeah, I like just tell you a bit of a life story, I guess.
Nice.
So yeah, it was like my first year of my undergrad, and for whatever reason, there was like a administrative fuck up. So I had like basically a semester off, and I spent the first like month or two just like smoking weed and playing Skyrim and kind of not doing anything. And then I was like, okay, that's kind of pathetic. So then I played a little game with myself, and the game was, okay, I literally took a piece of paper. On the left, I wrote all the things I was interested in, and on the right, I wrote all the things I wasn't interested in. So at the time, on the left, it was like, I think it was like squash, physics, and snowboarding.
Nice.
And then on the right, squash. it was like philosophy and history and art history and politics and religion. And I just made a big list of all the things I wasn't interested in. And then the game I was playing with myself was just, can I broaden my interests and basically force myself to be interested in something that I wasn't interested in before? And the reason like I was wanting to do that is because it's like that feeling when you like love like a song and you show it to your friend, and then your friend's just like doesn't get it. And you're like so disappointed that you love this thing and they don't love it. Like I realized I was that guy for things like poetry, and I was the one who wasn't able to see the appreciation of like economics and philosophy and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so it became just this like never ending project to try to get like underneath my own interests and become interested in things that I wasn't interested in. So it became like a meta interest.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like a super fun project. And that's basically how I got into philosophy. And that's how I started thinking about stuff outside of physics, which is what I was interested in, like in my undergrad and things. And so, yeah, I think that it's like super valuable to do that. And I just didn't want to be at the whim of my interests. I wanted to try to get underneath it and control it myself. And then it became this kind of like meta interest. So like now the more boring something is, the more I'm trying to become interested in it. So like a friend of mine is an accountant, and you could tell he doesn't like talking about accountants stuff at parties because people kind of just tune out. But I was like super interested to learn more about accounting because I didn't know anything about it. And we had a great conversation, and he taught me a whole bunch. And so Now, like the less interesting a subject, the more I try to find out what's interesting about it, because if other people find it appealing, then there's something there that I'm missing. So yeah, I guess I not only do I wish I could change my interests, but I like actively have sought that out as a project, and that's part of the reason you and I are talking here today. I'm just surprised that we haven't talked about that, because that's something I've like told other people before in the past. And
interesting. Yeah, I sometimes feel it in relation to something like engineering, where I have one of my interests is just understanding, how the history of progress and why progress occurs and why some people say it's not occurring right now, and like the problems thereof, and then related problems of academia and funding and all this related stuff of like how do we just make progress and how do we build shit faster, basically. And I have this weird duality of mind when I'm studying those subjects, because I love learning about people who have invented various things, right? Like mRNA vaccines. I'm like, fuck yeah. Like Kariko, whatever her name is, who just won the Nobel Prize. Let's go. Like, I just want, and I want more projects like that. I want more people to be doing like that. But I know my aptitudes and interests well enough to know that I could never be one of the people in the wet lab doing that sort of work, or for instance, being like an engineer who works with my hands or something like that. Like there are just various things that I know that when I sort of get into the details, I just find them like quite boring and I'm not good at it. And I'm fine learning about those fields and disciplines at a more abstract level, but doing it myself just causes immense amounts of pain. And this is the case even for various things in like machine learning and data science for me. So if you ask me to like sit me down and start like cleaning a data set and then building an ML pipeline to do task A, B, and C, odds are I'm going to find that extremely boring. It's going to take longer than anyone wants, and I'm going to be distracted, etc. But then if you sit me down and you say, try and prove this theorem, here's this abstract mathematical object, we want to understand its limiting distribution or something, then I'll just obsess about it all night. Yeah, that's cool. And you have to tell me to go to bed. And so in a way, when I'm kind of studying these subjects as just a side interest, I wish I had, for instance, the aptitude to sort of be a founder or something. I have this idea and I'm going to be a badass entrepreneur and build a bunch of cool tech that a bunch of people are going to use or something along those lines, right? But I just know I'm not going to do that. Like I'll just get bored and I'll drop off the project, right? And so I'm always in this weird state where, of course, you kind of, by definition, you love what you're interested in. So it's hard for me to say that I wish I was less interested in theoretical statistics and math and stuff. But I sort of had this meta desire that, I kind of wish I was one of the people who would just like build shit, who was like one of those kids who was like playing with robots and Raspberry Pis, like, and then
that's so funny.
So I have this weird conflict in me. And so I'm trying to map that back onto what you said. And I'm not quite sure how to do it. Like there is a difference for me, I think, between if you're trying to learn about a discipline as a whole, you can kind of latch on to those parts of it that track your other interests in some way, right? Like you're not forced to do it. So I'm with you when it comes to something like art history, right? So for a long time, I would have thought that was quite boring. And then someone can introduce a perspective on it, like an evolutionary perspective, say, right? Like, oh, this is actually super cool now.
Shout out to Boyd.
But in some sense, what you're doing there is just hijacking the relevant parts of the subject into some area of interest for you, right? And you're trying to forge a link between what's naturally interesting and the subject. And so I'm not sure. So, but if you sat me down and you were like, now you have to be an artist or something, right? Yeah. That I don't think I could do.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah. So I would make a distinction between like being interested in a subject area and actively doing it for your day job, first of all. So like one thing that I did when I was like 22 or something is I just volunteered to work at my mechanic, like in a shop for every Saturday, just to learn a little bit about cars. Nice. Because I knew nothing about cars. And anyone who knows me in my day life is like, this guy is not a handyman whatsoever. And so I wanted to learn a little bit. But that doesn't mean I would want to actually be a mechanic. It's just the day-to-day wouldn't appeal to me too much. And same with like being in a wet lab, like that does not appeal to me whatsoever, but I'm very interested in biology. And so I don't feel like one has to necessarily do everything because there's just the day-to-day experience of doing something. And if you enjoy it, then you should do that. And if you don't enjoy it, then I don't think there's any reason you should force yourself to enjoy it. Like it's interesting because like the mathematical stuff, like I wish I was better at it, and I'm just like my skill level just kind of like reaches a ceiling when it comes to the theory. But like the pipeline stuff and the building stuff, like that's my bread and butter. And I do that like when I'm sleeping, basically. And so I would distinguish between like, I'm interested in biology. I don't want to be working in a wet lab, from I'm interested in math. I wish I was better at math, but I just kind of feel like that's too much of a struggle, from I like making like full pipelines and machine learning, and I'm good at it. So I'm going to like, that's going to be my main activity just to stay productive and things. So I guess I would just say that like, I don't think it's cheating to say, be interested in learning about how cars work, but not want to be a mechanic. Just like, I don't think it's cheating to be interested in like data science and machine learning, but more interested in the theoretical side and not so much in the pipeline building side. And that's, to me, okay. But what I don't think is okay is if someone says, well, I'm just not interested in poetry, or I'm just not a math person, or I'm just not an XYZ, and they just shut off entire subject areas, and they don't even want to explore, trying to understand that area better. That's the move that I think is not okay, because I think that if there's a huge number of people all interested in something like NASCAR or triathlons, then there's some reason why it appeals to them. And I want to understand what that is. Even if once I understand it, it doesn't appeal to me, I still want to understand it. And that's what I'm interested in. And so for people who just say that they don't like a subject because they just aren't interested in it and aren't curious, that's the thing that I'm not a fan of, the lack of curiosity. But I don't think that necessarily requires you actually do everything yourself.
I don't think you can hold a lack of curiosity against someone. If someone's not curious in something, that's totally fine by my books. Like,
well, no, I think curiosity is actively something that should be kindled. I think that you should try to become more curious. Yeah,
that's very different from saying that as soon as you say, I'm not interested in learning more about this discipline, then you've made some sort of illegitimate, immoral move, right? That's a step too far.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that. I do think that every person should try to broaden out their curiosity and not give themselves outs by saying, I'm not a math person, I'm not an art person, or like it goes the other way. People will say, oh, I'm a science and engineering person, I'm not going to read poetry. Like, why would I read fiction? I only read nonfiction. And it's like, you have created this little cognitive straitjacket for yourself by just artificially limiting your curiosity. And so that's what I don't like, but it's not immoral, of course. It's just something that I think people can and should overcome.
Yeah. I mean, to be clear, I wasn't saying things, I wasn't making any sort of normative assertions about whether this is okay or not. I was just wondering if you experience that cognitive state of feeling sometimes as if you wish your interests were different than they were where you're at.
Well, I wish my skill was different. Like I wish I was more at your theoretical level. Like that's, but I feel like that I'll say that
that's always
in general. Because I always would try to work with people who are much more theoretically strong. And so like you and Rob are like the people that I put on the pedestal for like math. And so I wish I was there. But I don't wish I was in like a wet lab, for example. I just wouldn't like the day-to-day experience of that.
Yeah, same. But I sort of wish I did.
Really, like you wish you were, but then you wouldn't be able to specialize in anything. Like if you were in a wet lab, you'd wish you were a mechanic, and if you were a mechanic, you'd wish you were a surfer, and if you were a surfer, you'd wish you were you have to focus on something. Like
maybe, but I think the tension for me is more that I have this. Like I was just saying, like I have this interest in progress and stuff. And it's rare. Like if you're doing more theoretical work, it's just this gamble where it's unclear a priori how much your work is going to pay off. And sometimes it does, right? And this is not an argument saying you don't need theory. Like I think in some sense, the quandary that we've been in since the 1970s and et cetera, is maybe just a lack of funding basic research. And so I'm not at all on the side of like, we don't need theory and stuff, but the payoff is much less clear, and it's feasible to work your entire life on some branch of theory and then have it not pay out, right? Versus someone who's building something concrete and can say, I'm striving towards this thing and I'm trying to build this product. And, even if I fail, but here's the product I'm trying to build, or here's the vision I have. And again, like I love math and it's my interest for a reason, right? It's just sometimes as I'm reading about the history of humanity progressing throughout the ages. It's, you know, it's rare that it's like the mathematician who pushed us forward, and it's more the inventor, the innovator,
I could see like Paul Magorov, Shannon, Chug for sure. Like, like comma. Yeah.
Actually, the MacArthur, you know, the MacArthur Genius Grant. Their 2 awardees this year are both statisticians, so we're making moves, baby.
Yeah, you are. But so, okay, I have 2 questions based on what you said. So first, you said since the 1970s, but I don't get that reference. What happened in the 1970s?
Yeah, sorry, that was a slightly deep cut there. We shouldn't get into the whole thing now, but there's been so Tyler Cowen wrote this book in 2010, I believe, maybe even 2008, called The Great Stagnation, and the basic thesis is that throughout the early part of the 20th century, we're making huge gains kind of across the board: science, technology, health, biology, et cetera, and something sort of slowed down and broke in the 1970s, and we sort of stopped. Our lives have not been as transformed as they were in the preceding period. So a thought experiment along these lines is often, you know, if you imagine someone who was born in the early 1900s, and then you sort of take them to 1970, their life is massively different. All of a sudden, there's cars, there's planes, there's microwaves, there's fridges. Like if you walk into a house, you would barely even recognize half the stuff there. Versus you take someone who's born in 1970s and you give them 50 years, you put them to today, you can actually recognize most stuff. Obviously, there's one major exception there, which is internet and stuff, right? And so the question is, okay, how big of a factor has that been, right? So screens are obviously a big part of our lives. So there's debate over how big the stagnation was, but there is a general consensus that around in the early 1970s, approximately 1973, a lot of sort of trends that had been sort of linear, exponential up to that point really started tapering off, and we see a lot of like dying off of productivity growth, et cetera, and people sort of didn't notice it because of computers and tech that started picking up a lot of the slack. But in a lot of other areas, we've witnessed sort of like a big stagnation of growth and innovation and all this stuff. And so there's a lot of hypotheses as to why this is, right? Some people put it down to like culture and cultural pessimism and stuff. Some people talk about low-hanging fruit hypothesis and things like that. Yeah.
Is this related to like what the fuck happened in 1971?
Yeah. So there's So there's a website called What the Fuck Happened in is it 71 or 73? Anyway,
I don't know. I'll take care.
But exactly, that's exactly it. And it just compiles a bunch of graphs of things that had been going right, basically up until that point, and then just the tapering off of like of all these kind of things that you want more of. There's been sort of a big debate about if we're still in the great stagnation, and sort of Cowen, I think at the end of like 2020 or 2021 actually said, we might be emerging out of it now because we've actually seen some more innovation sort of across the board, like mRNA vaccines and health and like all this stuff, right? But then also sort of what caused it and all this stuff. So anyway, that's the general background there, which actually would be fun to talk about on the pod sometime, do sort of an intellectual history dive into that stuff.
Because I saw that website and I only skimmed through it and I wasn't sure if it was legit or not, or if they're just cherry picking graphs. But then I'm like, well, there's a lot of graphs here that they must have cherry picked. So I was like, I haven't put enough time to think about it. But if you say it checks out and Cowen says it checks out, then that makes me more interested. Yeah. But so I'm wondering how much of your question is, I want to call it like, I don't know,
I hate myself.
Just like self-loathing. No, like I want to say like the theoretician's lament or something. Just this idea, like, what I'm doing is what I'm doing actually valuable, or should I just like make a product? And is that
should I build an app?
because you're talking about broadening your interests, but could we reframe it like that's also part of the thing that you're wrestling with? Like, is the theory for anything, or is that?
Yeah, I think that's mainly it, right? Is like you do this theory and then but what I care about at the end of the day is driving humanity forward and humanity flourish and like
Ben with his humble ambitions. I'm just a guy driving humanity forward.
For nearly all I care is doubling GDP. But no, in terms of like big picture stuff, that's what gets me excited about like thinking about humanity flourishing and progress and stuff. But then when I sit down to do work, I'm just most excited about proving theorems. And it's like it's just kind of weird.
But
and I can't fully reconcile it. And it's not to say we don't need theorem proving. It's just a bit weird cognitively to have this absolute divorce between sort of what I'm actually doing and excited about day to day, and then what I read about at night. And in terms of feeling like, yeah, I mean, is this useful? Like, I don't know.
Well, so something similar happened to me in reverse. So my undergrad was in physics and computer science, and I loved studying physics and thinking about physics. But the actual day-to-day experience, like when I went to do research, I found I was just like way more stoked on programming neural nets, and that's what drove me towards the computer science side of things. And I just feel like there's literally no shame in enjoying your 8 to 6 period doing subject X and then thinking about subject Y, and they're all kind of related. For sure. But if you're stoked on like proving theorems, then you're going to do a much better job of that than forcing yourself to build products. And similarly, if I'm stoked on building products and I suck at proving theorems, then I'm not going to do a very good job at that.
Totally.
And so
that's what I mean, the meta desire, right? Like, I'm not saying you should force yourself to do something you don't like, but there's that question in the back of your mind, like, do I kind of wish I was the kind of person who liked doing that stuff more? And I'm honestly not sure what the answer is. Like, theory always runs into the problem where the point of theoretical research is it's hard to point to an immediate payoff, and it's sort of a gamble. Right. And you say oftentimes farther in the future, you realize there was a huge gain and this really paid off huge and it's underlied some novel technology or whatever it is. And sometimes it doesn't pay off. There's certainly branches of mathematics and theoretical statistics and all the stuff that's just going to languish, and not even languish, but it'll just be more like art. Right. There's people working on it, and it's more akin to doing poetry or writing novels for each other that only they can understand. I'm not even saying that's bad. I'm just saying that is a different project than building the next generation of solar panel or whatever it is. Right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Interesting. Well, shall we get a drink and get into it?
Yeah, let's dive in.
All right. Welcome to another titillating and tantalizing episode of Increments with your hosts, Vaden Masrani, and my boy, my business associate, Benjamin Moneymaker Chugg at Carnegie Mellon University. And this is Increments. We're starting to do these more formal podcast intros because people say they cannot tell our voices apart. So I don't know if this is helping, but we're trying to do this more. I'm
the one who always wins debates.
Exactly. And the better looking one, and the one who's always vaping in the background as well. So we have a Patreon. So check us out there. There's bonus episodes and early access to the main feed episodes. We have a Twitter account, YouTube, Discord. Come join us in the Discord. Send us emails. And I was going to ask people to start writing us reviews. We have no reviews on iTunes, but other podcasters do that. So if you like us, say something nice about us, and that'll really help us out. Any more formal podcast stuff we should?
That sounded really good. That sounded very professional.
Nice. I'm impressed. Yeah. I was like this morning, I'm like, shit, I have to come up with a new nickname for Ben, because this is my favorite thing about the podcast now, is just coming up with new nicknames. I have a couple in the bank, but I'm going to tease them out slowly, episode by episode.
So you're in the shower just thinking what you should call me for the...
Yeah.
I'm flattered.
Yeah, that's literally what I was doing this morning. Yeah. And I settled on Moneymaker because I thought it was funny.
Well, the man is always solving problems. So
So today we are doing hopefully the last of the AUAs before we switch back to the Conjectures and Refutations series. And so, Ben, you want to kick this puppy off?
All right. So Andrew Gleave asks, any suggested methods of reading Popper or others and getting the most out of it? I'm not from a philosophy background, and although I get a lot out of the books, I think there's probably ways of reading them where I could invest the same time and get more return. All right. What do you advise Mr. Andrew to do?
I have a lot of different things. I guess the first thing I would say is there's not a one-size-fits-all solution. So I'll definitely say a bunch of things that I do, but I've learned that telling other people to do the same things tends not to work. So the first thing I'd say is try all the different ways of ingesting and see what works best for you. So some people like audiobooks. I personally don't like audiobooks. My method is the PDF skim method, where I turn everything into PDFs and just skim through it as fast as possible. I call it skim reading, which is like the greatest invention ever. And it's just this idea that you don't need to fucking read every single word in a novel to call it complete, which I think people have in their head, that unless they read every word, they're not actually reading the novel. But when you're reading papers or when you're reading articles, you never do this. You just skim through until a paragraph grabs your attention, right? And so when you're listening to an audiobook, your mind is wandering until something the speaker says grabs your attention and you kind of snap back. So I figured I could just do that with PDFs. And so now when I read books, I just skim through it, read it completely out of order, and just find things that are interesting to me. And obviously this works much better for nonfiction than fiction. But even that, I wouldn't recommend everybody do. That's just something that works for me.
Oh, this person's the killer. Who knew?
But I'd say the major one, and then I'll pass it back to you, is I find that I can measure the amount of value I've gotten out of a book based on how much I find myself naturally referring to it in conversation. So I think the one thing that definitely works for all kinds of reading is just talking to people about what you've read and seeing how much you actually recall. Because there's some books that I've read that I couldn't really describe to you really at all. And those books, I think there's basically no difference between me having read them and me not having read them. Again, this is referring more to nonfiction than to fiction. So just talking to people and like having conversations about the book is, I think, one of the best ways to fully understand it. And if you really want to go nuts, you can start a podcast about a book, and then you'll really get all the material. But those are some random things that have worked for me. I'm curious what. I don't think you liked anything that I just said there. Your facial expressions are like.
I was just thinking,
like, about, God, what?
I'm sure we've all had those funny moments where some cute girl asks you what you thought of some book, and you just word vomit a bunch of random sentences at her, and as you're talking, you realize I have no fucking idea what this book is about. Yeah, that's got to be the worst feeling. You invested a number of hours into reading a book, and then you just absolutely have no idea what it's about.
But so terrible. But like by talking about it, so read a book, and then as you're reading it, try to describe what you've read to other people, and you'll quickly find that you don't understand stuff. Or they'll ask a question, and you'll be like, "Oh shit, he covered that in this chapter, but I don't remember." And then that's when you go back and reread that chapter, and just start actively engaging with the ideas. Like I have another friend of mine who doesn't use Discord, but he uses Reddit, and he debates on Reddit all the time. And that's great because he's actively engaging with ideas. And I like Discord. I don't like debating on Twitter, but I love having conversations on Discord and just talking about the ideas to people. I think is so key to understanding them, because you quickly find out what you know and what you don't know. And so if it's just a internal thing, then you'll lose it. But if it becomes part of your repertoire, part of the set of ideas you share with others, then it becomes much more of a part of you.
Yeah, nice. I'll second all of that. The one other thing I'd say is, for me, writing really helps. So whether you're writing just personally about the idea, or you're going to write publicly an essay about something, even if it's not an essay, I'm a big fan of these sort of Zettelkasten second brain kind of systems where you keep basically this giant network of notes on various subjects. And ideally, each note is sort of a little gem of knowledge that you have accumulated. And then what's nice is, depending on the system, you can link this to all these other little nodes of knowledge that you've accumulated over time. And then things start to have your own voice and tone attached to them. And I think an important part of understanding ideas is understanding where it fits in the giant network of ideas. So it's one thing to understand Popper, but it's another thing to understand what Popper was pushing back against, how he conflicts with various other notions of whatever it is, whether it's history, rationality, et cetera, right? So understanding, there's this library of views out there, understanding where each person is in that library and who conflicts with who and what differences they have. That's, I think, the biggest help for me. So not only understand the ideas, but how it relates to other ideas. How do you do that? I don't know. Writing and talking and everything you said, I think is spot on. Unfortunately, I think there's no easy way. I think you just have to be steeped in ideas and write about them and yell about them and tweet about them and all this shit. And I think that's kind of the only way to.
Well, and I think iterating on the way the ingestment method. So I wrote a bunch of things down, but even try Kindle compared to hardcover books compared to audiobooks and see which one sticks better. Or those reader summaries that you can. I forgot what the name of the subscription method, but you can pay for people to give you bite-sized summaries. And if that works, that's great. There's literally no shame in the way that you understand something. And so whatever device lets you understand something a bit better, do it. And so I would just trial and error the 10 different methods and see what works best for your life. The other thing I would say is, and this will lead kind of nicely to the second question. And the second question from Andrew is, any other books you'd say add to your personal philosophical development as much as Deutsch and Popper have? Who and why? So there, just to kind of merge the two questions, I realize that I don't read books as much as I try to understand thinkers. So I'm like, I could give you a list of 10 people who have really transformed my life, but I tend not to read all of their books. I tend to say, find Christopher Hitchens and then read a couple of his essays and then follow him all over YouTube. And then if he was alive doing podcasts, I'd follow him on the podcasts. Same like Douglas Murray or something. And so to me, it's less about a book and more about the brain that's produced that book. And so if you're reading stuff that was written 100 years ago, then obviously books are the only way to do that. But if it's a person who's alive today, very often I'll just find 10 podcasts they've been on and hear them describe their own book 10 times and get much more out of it than if I was to read the book itself. Like an example of this is Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. I haven't read it. I know all about it because I've listened about people like talk about it. I've listened to him talk about it. I know a good amount of the book, but I haven't read it. But I don't really feel like I need to because I have most of the ideas. And if I was to read it, I would just quickly skim through and see what things I've missed. So I think deprioritizing books as being somehow better than other ways of understanding information, because I think that people put books on a pedestal and like to say, I've read 500 books this week or this year, and here's the number of books I've read, and they just give you a count. Is it like that's much less impressive to me than just having 10 interesting things to say. And if you have 10 new interesting things to say that you get from podcasts or lectures or what have you, then I think that's equally valuable as reading. I think reading is just one way of getting information, but it's not the only way. And so I just want to like just take books off their pedestal as being somehow better than other ways of getting information, because I think they're just one way. And following speakers around, I think, is another great way to get information. So
yeah. Also, I think it's important to recognize with books that they're a product like anything else, and publishers and authors' incentives are not always aligned with your own incentives. So if your incentives are just, I'm trying to understand this idea in detail, in depth, as fast as possible, probably not the best way to do that is not reading a 400-page book front cover to back. But the publisher, books are around 300 pages for a variety of reasons, including like cost to produce the book and time it took the author to write it, et cetera. And if you're an author and you're trying to make your name by writing this book, you don't want to produce, you might be able to explain your idea in 20 pages, and that might be a fantastic 20 pages, but you can't sell that, right? Just because of, where we are in terms of book markets. And so, a book is not, it's not the optimal way to distill information, if there is such a thing, right? There's a whole industry behind it and incentive structure, and people are making decisions that have not, in terms of books that have zero to do with you actually understanding the ideas. So it's just one way that I think take books off the pedestal is to realize like, they're, one tool to understand ideas, but they're not optimized for the same thing I'm trying to optimize for. Yeah.
Cause I think people will say like, I've read 15 books this year. And then other people will be like, oh my God, I'm not putting in the work. I need to read 20 books, as if just counting the number of books you've read somehow maps on to like how many ideas you've downloaded, which it doesn't. And like, I will find that if I have 10 hours, say if I have 10 hours to understand something, and I could put 10 hours into reading a book, I could put 10 hours into listening to an audiobook, or I could put 10 hours into listening to 10 different interviews that the author has given. The last method is the best method. And the reason is that the author will naturally distill the most important points of the book in the conversation. So listening to Douglas Murray speak about his the Strange Death of Europe.
Death of the West or whatever.
I think it's The Strange Death of Europe.
Yeah.
Like I learned so much listening to him speak in 10 different podcasts. And for that, listeners, use Listen Notes, where you can design custom podcast playlists. So you can, instead of following just the Increments podcast and nothing else, like I know you all should be doing, you can go horizontally. You could say, I want to find every podcast that Ben has been on, and just get the podcast here, podcast there. So find every podcast that Matt Ridley has been on, or every podcast that Noah Smith has been on. And you can go laterally across podcast rather than top to bottom, down one. And so just I put a lot of stock into letting the authors distill the points themselves by listening to them speak. And I think that that's a treasure of great information that this just wasn't available like 100 years ago. And so I think part of the reason people privilege books is because 100 years ago, that was the only way you could get information. But now there's just so many other ways. And so I don't think that books should hold some special place in the pantheon of information delivery systems. It's just one of many different mechanisms. So what are some of the books who have added to your philosophical development? Give me some of your influences, bro.
Yeah, okay. So the first two on my list, we actually talked about one of them in a Patreon exclusive ep, but two books written by Sam Harris, which I don't think are his most popular books actually, but definitely influenced me the most, were one, his book Lying, which can barely be called a book, is mostly an essay, and two, his second essay on free will. It's hard for me to say if I just read Free Will at the right time where I was being introduced to these ideas. Like I'm actually, in retrospect, I'm not sure how good of an argument he makes. Probably good because of...
Oh no, it's rock solid. Yeah.
But I think I might have been close at that point to just accepting the ideas anyway, to being convinced. But anyway, that was sort of the cherry on top, I remember. And so for that reason, it's particularly prevalent in my mind as sort of the book that really tipped me over the edge to being like, yeah, fuck it. We don't have free will, and now I have to deal with all those consequences.
Well, so I remember you and I meeting many years ago and talking about this with your dad, who did not like the free will.
I think it was my girlfriend at the time, or it might have been also my dad, but my then girlfriend was also there and was not happy with it.
But I have this experience of like going around and just telling all of my friends that they don't have free will. And just fucking loving it. Oh my God.
Just zealot. Yeah.
And that's why like I totally get like the libertarian streak or the Austrian economic streak of like saying the provocative thing and then knowing that when people come back at you with like counter arguments, you've thought about all of them and you can knock them all down and just like I get that because I was doing that with free will. And then I think you and I talked about it, and you were the first person I met who had already read the book and agreed and was like, didn't need any convincing whatsoever, because we just like fully were on the same page. And it was just like interesting. That was one of the first early signs that you and I thought very similarly, I think.
I can't remember if we've said this on pod before, certainly off, but I do think there's a certain personality type or a certain psychological orientation that makes people either very accepting of the argument or very immune to it. I don't know many people who are sort of in the middle, who sort of say, we don't have free will, we don't. It seems like some people are just ready to accept it, and I put myself in that camp.
Well, there's a class of people who, like I think Brett Hall would fall in this camp, who initially accepted it and then was introduced to Deutsch and then unaccepted it afterwards. I think that's a fair summary, but please correct me. Listeners, or Brett, if you're listening. And so I think there's people who begrudgingly accept it, but are looking for outs because they don't like the implications. And that's where you get to the compatibilist stuff. And even like Tamler Summers is a dirty compatibilist. And I never really understood his
no, it makes no sense.
But that's a great example of like, I read the book well after I'd heard 100 hours of Sam Harris debating it. And I knew the argument inside and out because I listened to him debate it for so long. And that's maybe the other thing I should have added with the previous question is I think debates, oh my God, debates are such a source of good information. So if you can find a debate on something, that's the fastest way to learn what you think about a subject I've found. And so the free will subject just grabbed me because of how much relevancy it had to so many different aspects of our life, how counterintuitive it was, but then how cogent the arguments were. And I am very much a Deutschian and Popperian who have not budged an inch on the free will subject. I think Sam is rock solid. His case is rock solid. And anyone who disagrees, I think, has to go through his arguments in detail and provide like a point-by-point refutation of what he says, because he says a bunch of orthogonal arguments that all point in the exact same direction. Sorry, that's a contradiction. You can't point in the same direction if you're orthogonal, but different arguments that all leads to the same conclusion is what I'm trying to say. Yeah, no, two great choices. I would add The Moral Landscape to that list too. I think The Moral Landscape is phenomenal. I know that every ethicist and every person in the ethics department of schools hate that book, but I think it's because he basically is just, in a single book, refuted an entire field and showed that the whole field of ethics and meta-ethics and stuff is basically just running tails around definitions. But I'd definitely put Moral Landscape there too. Yeah, Sam Harris is a brilliant thinker, and I've learned so much from him. Yeah, so I was like, I could list some books, but I'd rather list thinkers, I think, because I'm much more influenced by people than by individual books. So I'll just list a bunch of thinkers, and then can maybe list some books inside that. But so besides the obvious ones, Deutsch and Popper, on my list were Nabokov, obviously. I don't talk about him too much on the pod because it's very hard to talk about him out loud, but you just got to dive in and see the worlds that he makes. It's unbelievable what he does with language. Orwell, Solzhenitsyn, Hitchens, of course, Pinker, Peterson. So Jordan Peterson is much maligned these days, but I've learned a lot from him. And I think that if you can look past all of the negative publicity and in particular go to his older stuff, like a lot of his lectures on psychology and on totalitarianism were phenomenal. In particular, he gave if you Google Jordan Peterson, Solzhenitsyn lecture, you can see a lecture he gave in like a decade ago. It's phenomenal. And Scott Alexander and Robert Sapolsky. So strongly recommend people dive into the land of Robert Sapolsky's lectures in particular. I think some of his stuff is out of date.
Yeah, you got to be on guard a little bit now.
Yeah, so I think he's a bit out of date, but his lectures on, was it psychology? I think it's, no, not psychology.
No, human behavioral biology.
Thank you. Yeah, human behavioral biology. That was one of the first areas that I just started studying purely for its own, because I was interested in it. Like I just Googled emergence lecture and then I saw one by Robert Sapolsky and it just completely like drew me in. In particular, his lecture on religion is just phenomenal.
Oh, dude, yes. Do you think Jesus was a schizotypalist still?
Yeah,
I still bring that fucking thesis up to people at parties. I love that.
Dude, it's so good.
It's so good.
Well, and the way that he speaks, it was like it is mesmerizing, and it like I really try to study brilliant speakers because he'll just an okay speaker will speak in sentences, a great speaker will speak in paragraphs, and excellent speakers like Sapolsky and Hitchens will speak in full essays. So the multiple paragraphs, arcs, and conclusions, and just listening to how they can do that is just, you can study that independently of the subject. So I put all them down. I'll toss it back to you. I have some other names, but
nice. Yeah, I really resonate with Sapolsky and Pinker on that list. I won't rehash why, but yeah, amazing. Yeah, so the next two for me are people we've talked about, but I think we've mostly talked about them in a perhaps negative light on the podcast, but I just wanted to highlight that their early thinking still plays a large role in how I think about the world. So it's McCaskill, and in particular the work Doing Good Better. So this was sort of his first book on EA related topics. And the thesis of the book is basically just pointing out that, if you're actually interested in consequences and not just virtue signaling your action, this can lead to a very different perspective on how you should be spending your charitable dollars, which I think is an incredibly valuable insight and one I still try and act upon. And I think is still not widely enough recognized. Yeah. Unfortunately, the public went from not knowing much about EA to being bombarded with long-termism. Yeah. And I think they maybe skipped the real nuggets of wisdom in there, but that's okay. Yeah. And then relatedly is Peter Singer, and in particular the book Animal Liberation. So I'm still, vegetarianism / veganism is still a pretty big part of my life. And I read that book after undergrad and couldn't refute it. And it took me about a year and a half of moral waffling before I finally figured out how to orient my life around not eating meat, etc. But, I did that near the end of my master's and then have been a vegetarian somewhere between vegan and vegetarian ever since. So that's had a huge impact on my life, and we don't talk about it much, but he's been a huge influence for me. Yeah, maybe I'll toss it back to you.
Yeah, no, all great. The vegetarian subject, vegan subject is one that I know I have no arguments against it, but I'm just not a good enough person to make the change. And the other thing is I just don't care enough, to be totally frank. I don't think too much about the suffering of chickens and shrimp. I know some people do, and I know some people are going to hate that I'm saying this, but it doesn't really keep me up at night. And what I
think lumping chickens in with shrimp is a little unfair. I know what you're trying to say, but that's a little bit unfair, I think. But yeah.
I think that as a society, we need to change. And I think that technology is going to be the way that we do that. And so for a while, I was donating to, was it the Good Food Institute? But so the way that I would kind of get past my moral guilt is just by giving money to places developing lab grown meat and these meat alternatives. But it's a collective action problem. And when restaurants don't have meat on the menu, I'll be fine. But when there's meat on the menu, I'm going to order it.
And meat's back on the menu, boys.
Yeah, I just don't really feel that bad about it either. It just doesn't bug me. And maybe that's just because I'm not as ethical a person as you are. But
No. I think that's right. I think that's the case for most people. And I think it's the same as if when you donate, $100 to the local soup kitchen, and you sort of realize that $100 might actually be able to do more good in Africa or something, but you don't stay up at night worrying about it. And it's precisely because of this distance problem with morality. Yeah. If you don't see the consequences right in front of you, then it's hard to care about it. And that's just, I think, how humans are wired. And so I think that's part of the inertia, is trying to overcome that, and trying to make the changes in your life so that, as Sam Harris always says, like you're just doing it without thinking about it. It just becomes part of your routine. And for some people, that's really hard. For me, cooking meat, etc., was it's annoying. It's annoying in some sense anyway, because if you're cooking it takes longer, it's more expensive and stuff. So I was just at a point in my life where my habits were malleable enough that it was actually not a huge sacrifice for me to give up meat. Also, when I moved to California, you're in a place where the vegan and vegetarian options there's a huge variety, and it's delicious. And honestly, I can't even say I miss it. I would like to think I would still be a vegan, if I had been alive in the 80s and the arguments were presented to me. But I actually don't think that's true, because I think it would have been much harder. And most of the vegetarian options just involved taking the regular option, throwing the meat off your plate, eating the veggies and the mashed potatoes or whatever. And so in that sort of world, I honestly am not convinced I'd have the sort of moral fiber to be a vegetarian. But yeah, I don't think it's any sort of moral failing, right? Yeah.
It's mainly the factory farming that is the problem, right? Like, I'm curious if
it's entirely that. So in principle, I actually have zero problem with if a cow is living a happy life and is raised and it's running around or whatever cows do naturally, and then shot in the head one day and then eaten. I have zero problem in principle with that. It's hard to make sure that your cows are sourced that way. And two, I think it's, if you start trying to track exactly where all your meat coming from, that's just a lot of cognitive effort. And it's expensive to get that kind of meat. And so it was easier for me to just draw a line in the sand and say, okay, I'm not even going to eat meat. But if I'm at an event where someone is like, I can guarantee you that this was sourced from here or something, modulo, I won't eat red meat because I'm just afraid what it'll do with my stomach at this point after years of not eating meat. But modulo those sort of issues, I would have absolutely no problem eating. Like if someone, went hunting and killed something, then I'd have no problem eating that.
So one question I have for you about this, and I'm just curious. So I don't trust anything I read about factory farming because I think it's all politically valenced. And I think the only way I would be able to make up my mind about factory farming is to randomly go visit 10 farms. Because I think that anything you read about factory farming is going to come through a lens of assuming it's evil already. And people who would defend it would be the farmers. But you don't have many farmers who also are bloggers or also public speakers. And so I don't know two sides of the argument on that particular subject. I only know one side. And frankly, I don't trust the information I get from that one side because I think it's very easy to cherry pick. Or maybe it is just as awful as everyone's saying, but I don't know. And so the only way that I would honestly be able to make up my mind on the ethics of factory farming is to randomly go to 4 or 5 of them. And I'm curious what your take on that is. If you have seen defensive, like, have you read anything on the other side of that debate?
Yeah, I mean, the other side, so I'm surprised to hear you say that because I think the other side often just makes the economic argument, right? And says like, it's just space efficient and No,
so I'm talking about the suffering argument. I'm talking about like, if you go to a farm, a random factory farm, and I'm not talking about pundits debating factory farming. I'm talking about how much suffering actually takes place at a farm in the United States. So the suffering argument alone. Like you can see these PETA videos where animals are just brutally tortured and massacred. And is that representative? Is that like one bad kill out of 100,000 kills that are completely painless? How penned in are they?
It's normally not the kills that people are worried about. It's normally the penning and stuff, right? So like having pigs and chickens. Like what you can do is just look up the proportions of look up like how many chicks are normally in a cage and then look at the proportions of the cage and just do some math, right? That's a way to kind of get around the...
Well, so one thing there is I know that so Helena's dad is a chef in Calgary. Shout out to Scott. Amazing chef. And we would debate various food issues many, many years ago. And he made an interesting point that like when people talk about like free range chickens, what is legally required to be classified as a free range chicken is you have to cut a hole in the bottom of the barn and allow them to leave. But they don't leave because they don't want to leave, because chickens don't care about sunlight and stretching their legs in the same way that human beings do. And so even penning them in small areas, I don't know what a chicken thinks about that. Right? You can assume it's bad, but I just want to see it myself before I make claims or statements about how much suffering takes place in these places. And again, and maybe it's exactly as PETA represents it, but I'm just slightly skeptical of representations of these areas, because they always come from activists, and activists have an agenda. And I just wanted to see a counter agenda from like the farmers, and see if farmers agree with this representation or not. And I don't know where to even go. So maybe if people have a source where I can hear some farmers talk about it, then I would love to have that source, but I haven't been able to find it. So,
I mean, yeah, definitely PETA's taking the most egregious cases, but if chickens were actually living happy lives in factory farms, then it would be quite easy to get footage of that. And you would expect, like, the lack, in some sense, the lack of evidence on the other side is evidence of absence, right? Because if it was very easy to just say, this is crazy, look what, PETA's putting out this stuff, but here's our farms and it's totally normal, right? There's a reason why there's ag-gag laws and stuff, and people can't film factory farms and there's security, and it's very hard to visit, right? If it was the case that all was well and fine, I don't think you wouldn't have that you wouldn't have those laws, right? You wouldn't require those sorts of laws.
But can you so I imagine you go to a farm, you take a photo of all the chickens, and there's a lot of chickens, right?
Well, you can't just walk into a farm, right?
But you're saying if we didn't have these ag-gag laws, then you could do this, right? You could go in, you could just take photos of all the chickens and all the cows and all the sheep. And I'm sure it would look very chaotic, right? But again, I just don't know how much information you can get from a visual image like that. Like, it'll either look crowded, or you could take pictures of all the dead animals and make it look terrible. And again, maybe that's representative, but I just haven't seen a healthy debate from both sides on that subject, and that's what makes me slightly reticent to totally take it on board. But point taken that maybe there's not a debate because there's just no counter argument, or maybe there's not a debate because the farmers are just so sick of being demonized by activists that every time they've tried to engage in such a subject, they're vilified, and then they just have decided not to engage. So I don't know. Is all I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I mean, one thing is to say is, like, farmer here is a bit of a euphemism, right? So there's a big difference between factory farms and your normal, like, dairy cow.
Sure,
farmer.
I'm talking about
those are extremely different
factory
things,
farmers.
Right? So that's like a huge operation, and like these places are fucking massive. This was actually part of my work at Stanford, was trying to figure out where they are. Because
that's right.
Yeah. So I do know a decent amount about, at least their geographical spread out and how big they are and stuff like this. But again, so you can, like, do the basic, like, if your claim is, well, I need the chicken to tell me in English.
No, I just want to see it.
I'm not sure what to tell you.
No, my claim is I just want to be invited to a factory farm and just go for a walk. That's my claim. I just want to just see it. Yeah. That's all.
Actually, there's a great Stuff You Should Know episode, which is a podcast that's slightly lower ranked than Increments, I think. It's just a couple fewer listeners than us. And Chuck used to have a job as something in hardware or something. And he describes, they're actually talking, it's a episode on chicken welfare. And he describes how his company was invited to a factory farm to see how, like, the stuff that, like, what was implemented of the stuff they were building or something. It's just some invite. And he said he had to leave halfway through. It was so bad. And he was so confused as to why the farm had invited their company. Because he was like, this has got to be the absolute worst advertisement ever, because
awesome. That's
so you should anyway, I'll put that episode in the links.
Totally check it out. Because honestly, that's the kind of stuff I'm looking for. For
but again, that's still anecdotal, right? Like, if you're convinced on being skeptical until there's what you
I'm not
perfectly healthy debate, right? Because all I'm saying is, like, the perfectly healthy debate cannot happen for a variety of reasons, and you seem to be assuming it's not happening because of like activist types are threatening farmers instead of like what I was pointing to at the beginning, why there are arguments in favor, and they typically are economic arguments, is because I think that's precisely the only kind of argument that actually
that's fair.
Is in favor of factory farms. Is you say, look, we're trying to feed this many people in the US, this many people eat meat. You can't have factory farms everywhere because they smell really bad and the manure problems are horrible, right? They actually need to be fairly concentrated because we can't have them just building in like all these communities. And so they need to be, so like, I think the farmer's argument is like, you need to curtail demand, right? All we're doing is like supplying the animals, and there's, millions and millions of pounds of meat eaten in the US every day. Someone's got to supply that, right?
Yeah.
And so this is the, we're doing the best we can. So my point is that there are arguments in favor, but they tend to be economic arguments. And there's a reason they tend to be economic arguments, is because those are the only kind of arguments that are even like possibly justified, right? Instead, there's a reason they don't come out and say, actually, the animals love it, right? When like they're injected with all these stuff and they're twice their normal size, and like, yeah, I think it takes a lot to say that a chicken is fine with being like twice the normal size, like of a chicken, just a normal chicken. Like if you have a chicken that's twice the size of a normal chicken, it strains credulity a little bit to say that this chicken is living a perfectly happy, helping, flourishing life, right? And then of course, you could shrug your shoulders and say, we should study that. We should have a chicken RCT, or like, we should teach the chickens to speak English so we can talk to them. That's fine. But I'm just saying but check out the Chuck episode. Seriously, it's good. Yeah. He's sort of a neutral bystander, and I think. Yeah, no,
that'd be great. I don't know what an optimal size for a chicken
is. A buff chicken.
They're
stoked. They're
just a fucking strong chicken. So I always like knowing thinkers I like, okay, that was a terrible sentence, but hopefully it tracked.
Talk about speaking in essays and paragraphs. We're trying to just get through the individual words here. I'm just trying to make sure the second word I say isn't the same as the first word.
So other people who've had a bit of influence on me. So Dan Savage, if people don't know Dan Savage, definitely check him out. He's sex and relationships. But Helena and I have an amazing relationship, and it's because of a lot of the wisdom that we've learned from Dan Savage. And so just dive in. I don't know what he's talking about these days. I haven't listened to him in many years, but he's good. So he's a good source. On different sources or in different subjects, I have different go-to thinkers. So like on the environment, I'm just going to list a bunch of people really quickly. I like Matt Ridley, like Steven Pinker, like Hans Rosling, Bjorn Lomborg, Václav Smil, of course. A bit more controversial, but I really like Alex Epstein and Michael Schellenberger. Sorry for all of your environmentalists who hate those guys, but I've learned a lot from them. On race issues, I got Glenn Laurie, John McWhorter, Camille Foster, Coleman Hughes, Chloe Valdry, kind of like the canonical five Black intellectuals who are pushing back against the dominant orthodoxy surrounding race in the United States. On the woke subject, who do I like? I like Jordan Peterson, make no apologies for that. Douglas Murray, Sam Harris, Stephen Hicks, I like him too. And James Lindsay, even though he's a bit of a menace on Twitter, he has some great resources on his site. I forgot the name of his site, but he knows the shit. And so I've learned a lot from James Lindsay as well. And so
the dude's so hard to take seriously these days.
No, for sure. I know it's like, it's easy to look at a handful of tweets and stuff and then dismiss the entire bodies of work. But I think that it's, I mean, honestly, if people say, I don't want to listen to Jordan Peterson or James Lindsay, I'm like completely fine by that, because I'll know way more about the argument than they will. And so I just won't drop their names. Even Ben Shapiro, like I've learned a lot from Ben Shapiro, but I know that I just won't say I got an idea from him because people immediately turn off, but their loss, not mine. So I like listening to these people. And on the feminism subject, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Christine Hoff Sommers, and Camille Paglia are all great. So just wanted to quickly drop some names for various leads of people who have informed my worldview. And then I have one last thing to say, but I will wait to pass back to you, and then I'll say that last thing.
Nice. Yeah, I didn't go subject by subject. I'm a little more, was just thinking about big sort of perspectives that I have on the world. So a big one for me is I'm quite drawn to the absurd. So Thomas Nagel was actually a big influence for me there, both to do with, his essays on the absurd and also in moral luck, which are pretty big ways I think about the world. And then there's a couple of people on sort of like incrementalism slash, I don't necessarily want to say libertarianism, but skeptical of maybe like huge government intervention or of what government can do. And those are, so James Scott, who's written a couple good books along those lines. Yeah, Seeing Like a State is his classic, and then Against the Grain is the other one, and then Jane Jacobs, who wrote a couple of great books, but Death and Life of Great American Cities in particular, which shows you how difficult it is to design a city from the top down. Brasilia being the horrid, infamous example of trying to do that and it not working out at all.
Is the term authoritarian high modernism? Does that come from?
Yeah, I think he just calls it high modernism. I don't think he calls it authoritarian high modernism, but high modernism, I think, is a term coined by James Scott.
Yeah, okay,
or at least he popularizes it. Yeah. And so this is, just the difficulties of government organizing certain kinds of activities and the idea of legibility. So for government to take action, they have to make certain problems and populations and characteristics legible. So they have to be able to look at statistics, aggregate statistics about them. But some sorts of problems are not super amenable to having nice, clean aggregate statistics. And so there's a lot of problems and information that is lost in translation as you try and do that. And then some just random, more philosophical orientation stuff. So I've been influenced to some extent by some Buddhist ideas. So in particular, there was this Buddhist monk, Thich Nhat Hanh, who I think he died in 2022 at some point, maybe early on in 2022, I believe. But he wrote these two books. Well, he wrote a couple books. One is Peace is Every Step, and the other one is True Love, which were sort of like classic Buddhist teachings of just like being in the moment and appreciating things, etc. But I read those at a sort of maybe slightly more vulnerable point of my life, and they just had a big influence on me. So
how do you use Buddhism and their influence in your day-to-day? How does it influence you in your day-to-day?
I think it's just one of those sort of general perspectives you have on life in terms of only trying to control the kind of things you can control, and just recognizing that most often when people are like dicks to you or whatever, they're often going through some sort of turmoil that you know nothing about. And like everyone is facing problems that you don't know about. And then the classical Buddhist teachings of sort of, there's a lot of suffering in life, and you can always try and avoid that, or you can recognize that in some sense that is a part of the human condition, and you can try and accept that in some way. So I've been influenced by those ideas. And relatedly, my last stuff is actually Stoicism stuff.
Yeah, I was just going to say it sounds very Stoic.
Yeah. So that's my last, I would say, influence along maybe the emotional dimension. I'm not sure what to call all this. But Stoicism, unfortunately, has gotten, I think, a bit of a bad term. It's a little bit of a cringe term in podcast land these days. But that's for a reason. It became popular for a reason. And like everyone in Silicon Valley who was Stoic there for the past 10 years or whatever. There's a reason. There's a reason they picked it up. And I'm not saying it can solve every problem in your life, but there are some hugely valuable gems, I think, in terms of how to deal with pain and suffering and anxiety and everything that you're going to go through. And so just to actually give a couple concrete suggestions that I've got from Stoic readings that I've implemented in my life that have really helped. One is this thing called negative visualization. So this is just something you do where you visualize, you take your life and then you imagine your life without some part of it. So often people imagine their life augmented with something, but here you say, okay, what if I didn't, for instance, have my partner, or, I didn't have my dog, or I didn't have running water, whatever it is. You just kind of try and sit in that state for like 10 minutes, and it's amazingly valuable. And you really come out much more grateful than you went going in. And it just, reminds you sort of how lucky you are in a lot of ways. And then there's this other trick. I forget what sort of Stoic teacher recommended doing this, but just viewing hardships as challenges sent by the Stoic gods. And so it sounds silly, but it actually works in some way. So you have a particularly challenging day or week or month or whatever, and you just like, okay, like how am I going to get around this? These fucking Stoic gods are throwing some shit in my way, and like now I have to deal with this somehow. And it sort of makes it more into problem solving type of stuff. Yeah,
a good buddy of mine, Brad. Shout out to Brad, who does not listen to the podcast because he's a stubborn asshole, but love him to pieces. And him and I have talked a lot about Stoicism, and he does a negative visualization thing every time he meets somebody. And so he'll, before we go for drinks or whatever, as he's walking to meet up, he'll just think like, what if this is the last time I get to have a conversation with Vaden? And it just allows him to appreciate this that moment just a little bit more. And I just think it's an amazing
nice.
Practice. My brother sent me an amazing Stoic lecture by a lecturer whose name I forgot, but I'll link to it in the show notes. And the lecture ends with a line that I have not been able to get out of my head. I just love. And he says that Stoicism teaches that everyone will die, but not everyone will die whining. And I just love that.
Exactly.
And I just thought that was a good line. I totally agree with all that. I haven't read as much Aurelius as I should, but I've been told by Brad that I've kind of just incorporated Stoicism into my life already. In the sense that I've a long time ago, I came up with this idea of a serenity fund. So my serenity fund is every year I mentally set aside a couple $1,000. I don't literally do it. I just say $2,000 is going in the serenity fund. And then if I lose an iPod or my bike gets stolen or just some bad thing happens, I just take it out of the serenity fund and I don't care.
And then you yell serenity now.
Yeah, serenity now. But it's just like, stuff's going to happen. And if you just put some money aside, either actually or just mentally, then when bad things happen, you just take it out of the serenity fund and you're fine. And you just don't let it bug you very much. The last thing I want to say, and this is not one of the questions, and it might open up a bit of a interesting new direction, is we've been talking a lot about thinkers we love and respect and have learned a lot from. But I think there's also a huge amount of value in studying anti-thinkers or anti-heroes, or people who you don't respect, people you don't like, people who are making arguments that you think are bad in some way. And by bad, I don't mean just like uninteresting, but in the sense that they're actively putting forth information that people are consuming that are getting them confused. So the Weinsteins are two prominent examples. But I just listed a number of thinkers who I don't respect and don't like and have studied a lot because I think that there's a lot of value in doing that as well. Most of them have come from early skirmishes with the new atheists in the the mid 2000s. So people like Glenn Greenwald, Reza Aslan, Mehdi Hassan. If you study the debates between them and Hitchens and Harris, and you go into the nitty gritty, you'll find, or at least I found, that a lot of the arguments they're making are just appallingly bad, but hard to spot and very ideological. And I would love to do just a whole episode on why Noam Chomsky is fucking awful. There's a great essay, which people should read, called A Potpourri of Chomskyan Nonsense, written by a linguist. I think her name is Christina Bohm. I might be getting the name wrong. Going in great detail about Chomsky, not only not his political stuff, but his linguistic stuff, and how most of that actually is quite vacuous, besides his takedown of... Yeah.
Even though, wouldn't most linguists acknowledge that he founded a large part of their field, not founded the field, but paradigm shifted their field, or no?
So I think a lot of his major contributions, universal grammar is very true. Mm-hmm. He was instrumental in taking down B.F. Skinner. So I guess he wrote just a viscerating review of Skinner's book. And so I think one of his major contributions is destroying behaviorism and putting forth the idea that we have an innate language instinct, basically. But if you go into his more niche stuff after that, what Christina shows is that a lot of it is vacuous, and he'll like actively attack his own students in print, and it's brutal. So I think one can learn a lot from studying people who one despises and seeing the kinds of arguments that are made that just seem plausible at first pass, but then actually fall flat. And so, so other ones, Robin DiAngelo, I think everyone should read White Fragility. It's just appalling, but I think it's important to read. Kendi, obviously, Judith Butler, her obfuscatory manner of writing. I think it's very important to study this stuff too. So I would just put a list of people who are anti-thinkers, anti-heroes, and you can learn a lot from them.
Okay, so Alex Giorev, God, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I'm probably not. Apologies. Asked a question about rational versus anti-rational memes. So he says, are you aware of general types of insidious anti-rational memes which are hard to recognize as such? Any ideas on how we can go about recognizing them in our own thinking? And he says, I do realize that perhaps no general method exists, but still, if you have any thoughts on this, I would appreciate it. So yeah, just as a reminder / introduction to rational versus anti-rational memes. So a meme is just, think of it as an idea that's sort of spreading through culture for whatever reason. And the prefix anti-rational versus rational refers to the method of spreading. So how is it spreading? So a rational meme means it's spreading because it's solving some problem. So it's some useful bit of information, and it's got some amount of truth contained in it such that it allows us to do things or solve some problem that we have. So basically just think of it as like a good idea. Versus an anti-rational meme spreads because it suppresses any method by which it would be criticized. So a classic example is various religious ideas. So it's often said that any form of doubt in religion or of a religious figure is being seeded by the devil.
Wait, that's not true? That's not true?
That's yeah.
Shit.
I just accepted it.
Yeah,
Man. I just,
drop a truth
I'm
bomb
riddled
over
with
here.
devils, and that's it. And that's it. So what does this do? This says you can't criticize the idea that Jesus is the Son of God / is God. We're a little confused about that a couple thousand years later, but that's okay. Because any such doubt is actually just being introduced to you by the devil. So you better believe with all your heart, and you better not tell anyone else about your doubt, because you'd indicate to them that that your thoughts are being taken over by the devil. And so this idea of Jesus being the Son of God will spread throughout the population because people are afraid to criticize it, because any criticism is labeled as evil, essentially. Versus a rational meme, which would spread because it's useful. So, for instance, Vaden's trying to spread the meme that not everyone needs to finish books, read them front to back to get the ideas out. And if that spreads, that'd be an example of a rational meme, I would say, because it's just useful information and we're not trying to suppress criticism of it. Okay, so but just to clarify, I think people often get this wrong, is anti-rational versus rational just refers to the method by which the idea is being spread. It doesn't actually mean it's true or not. So it doesn't have to do with the truth or falsity of the idea, or even if it's a good or bad idea, or like moral or immoral or anything like that. It solely has to do with the actual method, the method of transmission.
Just to add, so I'm sure many of our audience will know this already, but just for those who don't, so the word meme now is associated with like images with text on the top and the bottom. But it originally was coined by Richard Dawkins, where he wanted to take a evolutionary lens on ideas. So he talked extensively about genes, but he also recognized that the idea of mutation and selection can also happen in, say, notions of fashion, where I see Ben's looking fly as fuck right now, and I want to copy him. But I don't copy his fashion style perfectly. I make a small little modification to it. And so it goes. So the notion of a meme should be thought of as like applying evolutionary ideas of selection and a blind variation and selective retention to ideas. So then Deutsch adds on top of this notion that you can have these ideas spread through rational and critical methods, which is what you're referring to when you're talking about solving problems, or irrational methods. And so in the quote, which we're not going to read from Alex, but in the quote, he basically says that the easy examples are the religious ones. That's maybe easy. But Alex's question is, are there examples outside of religious examples that also are anti-rational memes that perhaps are hard to recognize? So I have a couple, but maybe you want to start?
So, yeah, okay. So one we should just get out of the way, I think, is obvious, and it'll probably be both on both of our lists, is some ideas that fit under the general umbrella of wokeness. Everyone's racist, and if you say you're not racist, you're especially racist because you have some embedded idea or some embedded privilege or original sin, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, so that's called the Kafka trap, right? Do you know the term Kafka trap?
Yeah, it comes from the trial.
Yeah, the trial. Yeah, exactly. Where a Kafka trap is basically you're accused of being X, and then you deny being X, but denying X is taken as evidence that you actually are X, because if you were X, you would deny X. So you're accused of being racist, and then you deny being racist, and that's just exactly what a racist would say. And so it's a classic Kafka trap. And once you kind of can recognize that move, it takes some of the power out of it. But 100%, yeah, wokeness is a huge example. And arguably, that's still a religious example. If you take McWhorter's line, which I do.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, here may be some slightly more controversial ones. For a long time, especially sort of 2021, maybe, there was a lot of people tweeting stuff like follow the science, where science was capitalized as if it was something, right? And so here, what you're doing is you're basically shutting down criticism unless you're like a credentialed expert. But then everyone has their own idea of exactly what a credentialed expert is. So it's a bit of an issue. But here you're just shutting down criticism of ideas by anyone who doesn't have like MD, PhD or something next to their names. And everyone's just shouting this at one another and not providing any arguments. But one person saying, you need to wear a mask, follow the science. And the next person says, masks don't work, follow the science. And then no one's actually going down to the object level of like, hey, what sort of evidence are we referencing about whether masks work or not? We're just going to shout, follow the science at one another. And I get we were in like a global pandemic situation, and there are genuinely very difficult social epistemological problems of how to deal with that, right? And like how you treat institutions and how much deference you show authorities and like what the fuck we do and no one knows what's going on. That's a topic for another conversation, but all extremely difficult and pertinent and real problems. But just shouting follow the science at people as if science is some source of knowledge that speaks for itself and you can just look at science as if it's some objective thing that you go to the science, www.science.org, and you see what science has to say about something, and then you follow it, is one, a misunderstanding of what science is and the scientific method, but two, just sort of is, I think, a classic example of an anti-rational meme.
Yeah, well, very related to that. So back to my new hobby horse, Andrew fucking Huberman.
Oh, here we go, baby. So, a Huberman special's coming up. I can feel it.
Yeah, well, if we do it, like I want to not do it in the way that the Decoding the Grooves people are now doing things, which is just selectively choosing clips because that's cheap. So I'm trying to figure out.
I think someone should do that to them. I think it would be funny. They have enough content that you could totally catch them saying some crazy shit because they trip over their tongue all the time. And
I totally agree. But yeah, so a couple things that Huberman does that I really don't like that we could argue about if they're anti-rational memes. I think that they could be classified that way for sure. But we can also just talk about like deceptive communication styles. So studies show is a classic one. And people say studies show. That's equivalent to follow the science. If you're going to talk about studies, tell me about a specific study that like everyone agrees is a high profile study. So I'm not saying don't listen to studies, but the studies that I'll talk about are the ones where like example of a famous study. So the study about happiness linearly increasing until you get to 70K or 80K, and maybe that number's changed a bit now, and then kind of plateauing but going up slightly after that. That's like a study, as you can say, study show. But the reason I don't have a problem with talking about that particular study is it's well studied, it's famous, and it's not just saying trust me. But when Huberman talks about studies show, he'll say, well, studies show that sunlight in the eyes are good, or studies show XYZ are good. But then he won't apply that to other circumstances where...
What's the newest thing? Grounding. That's
grounding. Yeah, is that
stand outside and
just
ion transmission, bro.
Yeah, put your toes into the grass. But so another thing that he does that I really don't like that is harder to track is... I want to come up with a name for it, but it's like... distracting details or something, where he'll go very deep into the weeds and the minutia about how this chemical affects this neurotransmitter in this particular part of your brain, and then he'll explain the nitty-gritty about that, and you feel like you're learning, but you're not actually learning because the facts that you're being given first is completely unhelpful in your life. It's not terribly going to be relevant. You're just being given a recitation of facts. You're not being given an argument or something you can actually understand. So Sam Harris never does this, right? So Sam Harris will make an argument that you can either understand and disagree with, or you understand it, you either agree or disagree. But when you're given a list of facts, that's just kind of making it sound deeper than it actually is. Because with most nutrition science, there are so many things happening at once that any one thread of like deep facts, like that's relevant for like researchers putting forth new hypotheses and coming up with new drugs. But for the lay audience, all that really matters is what is the effect of this drug when put to a clinical trial. That's why you put stuff to clinical trials. So I could make a case about how like Doritos chips are good for you, because I could go through the ingredients list and talk about how this one chemical has this effect on your dopaminergic system. And I could go and spend 4 hours talking about the effect of the chemicals in Doritos chips and their effects on your neurotransmitters. And that would maybe seem like I'm making a case that Doritos chips are good for you. But really, I'm just distracting you with unnecessary information that is taking the place of a good explanation. And so that's where Deutschian stuff really matters, is that when you're getting these lists of facts, you're not getting explanations. Or you are about stuff that are not relevant to the actual material at hand. And in particular with nutrition, there are so many different factors happening in your body at once that you can tell essentially any story you like, but at the end of the day, what matters is clinical trials on with large sample sizes. And so until you show me that, it doesn't really matter what the details of the neuro pathways and stuff are. Like it does matter. I'm not saying it's irrelevant, but I'm saying that's a way to kind of distract people from what's important when making a claim about health. And so it's a kind of an insidious way to appear authoritative and informative while actually not delivering explanations, but just delivering recitations of facts that will actually not improve your life or give you any like cognitive thinking tools. So that's kind of an example of what I would say is an anti-rational meme, because your critical faculties are being distracted by having to memorize the names of neurotransmitters, when really what matters is just what is the effect of this drug when given to a large number of people, and what are the consequences, because those microscopic details matter for PhD students and people who are trying to come up with new drugs. But for the public, that information doesn't matter. And when you go on to like Huberman, and so one way that I kind of tell the effect of a podcaster is spending a couple hours like going through the subreddits and seeing what everyone's talking about. Like, so on the Decoding the Gurus now, their subreddit is just dedicated to just trolling everybody. And so they're just discarding all sorts of thinkers that have interesting ideas, because the guru people are just dismissing everybody essentially. And with the Hubermanites now, they're like, everyone is defending different kinds of supplements, and every supplement is just defended by this like long exposition about the effect of the neurotransmitter. Like, I don't even have the language, because I don't need that language, because it's not valuable in my life. And so I don't know what term we should come up with this, but it's like this fact distraction thing that's getting in the way of I'll just use it unabashedly, of good explanations. And I think that is an example of a particular kind of anti-rational meme that should be recognized.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, it strikes me that really depends on what subject matter you're talking about. Because often the object level explanation of why something is happening is the correct lens of like, should we trust this thing? Like, here's what's actually going on to make this thing happen. And just citing a study is often the wrong move, because there's so many studies pointing in so many different directions that like what you want is like an actual explanation of like how this works, right? So like for instance, economics might be where you want to take the opposite perspective, and probably what you care about there is the mechanism. Like, okay, how are people actually being lifted out of poverty? Like, don't just show me RCTs of this thing working or not working, because that is valuable to some extent. But you also want to know, like, when people, get the UBI or whatever it is, what are they doing with it? Like, how are they getting out? Are they founding companies? Are they investing it? Are they moving abroad? Like, what's the mechanism by which people are being, for instance, raised out of poverty, right? And so it's maybe it just comes down to the level of explanation or the correct level of detail for the conversation. Like, what's the most relevant for our decision making right now? And also, it's clear that most people listening to Huberman's podcast are not going to have the relevant expertise to judge what he's saying. Yeah. So maybe the right test is, could you start changing random words in his sentences to other things, and would anyone notice? And probably the answer is no for when he's explaining this stuff, right? Like maybe, yeah, so the PhDs in neurobiology might notice, but if he starts swapping the word neurotransmitter with glycosol and whatever, like, is anyone going to be able to be any of the wiser? And probably not.
Well, it's a similar move, and I'm not saying Huberman's a conspiracy theorist. I'm definitely not saying that, but it is a similar move to what conspiracy theorists.
He just winked, though. He shook his head, but winked. So take.
Well, so what happens when you debate a conspiracy theorist about like 9/11? You're going to be bombarded by microscopic facts about the melting point of steel that you can't possibly refute. And the conspiracy theories are much worse than Huberman, because then they build this grand narrative about everyone being out to get you and stuff. And Huberman's definitely not doing that. Of course not. But the same move of being bombarded by facts as a way to kind of just bamboozle and confuse while seeming informative and authoritative. I think that is a similar mechanism between the nutrition stuff and the Huberman stuff. I would distinguish. I think Peter Attia is better. So I've listened to a bit of Peter Attia, and I think he doesn't do that nearly as much. So I'm not saying all of the health people in that ecosystem do this, but Huberman seems to do it quite a lot. So I guess want people to be on guard for like when you're being given a regurgitation of superfluous or unnecessary facts in place of a cogent argument or a clear explanation. And in particular with health, I think that those kind of details are relevant after large RCTs have been done and we have a clear sense that the effect is real. So after the FDA has approved something, then I think it's quite valuable to go back and say, okay, why is this actually working? But before the FDA has approved something and before there's the clear evidence of effect size, tracing all these microfacts are just distracting because we don't even know if it's working or not because of how and it's not a coincidence that economics and nutrition both can sometimes do this, where you're dealing with complex systems and there's so many things happening at once that you can pursue any arbitrary line of facts anywhere, but that's relevant after the effect has been conclusively demonstrated, not before. Before, that's relevant for like PhDs and researchers and stuff, but for the lay audience, it's just unnecessary. And I just think it gives people the sense that they're getting really accurate, super great information when in fact it's more likely to just be inconclusive. And I think that the job of a public intellectual is to simplify such details when it's necessary, and conversely, to take simple things and make a point about how it's much more complicated. So I think the job of a public intellectual, one of their jobs is simplifying the complex and complexifying the simple. And I think that Huberman doesn't do this well.
Yeah, nice. Okay, so I'm going to switch the subject. Another one I thought of, which is kind of a funny one, which I'm not sure how seriously people take this, but I think they did for a while in rationalist circles, is Roko's basilisk.
Yeah.
This is the idea that if you don't, people were literally afraid to name this phenomenon for a while, but this is the idea that if you know super intelligent AGI is on the way, but you're not doing all you can to bring it about, then once it is born or shows up or whatever, then it's going to punish you for not helping it arrive sooner, right? So now you have, as soon as you hear about this thing, you have this moral obligation to now help it arrive as soon as possible. Otherwise, you could be punished for the rest of your life. And obviously, this is actually, in some sense, the opposite of an anti-rational meme, because it was asked, I think, to not be spread, right? Because as soon as you hear about the concept, it was like intellectual plutonium. Insofar as soon as you hear about it, like it was a moral obligation, I think, on the forum for people never to mention it. Because as soon as you know about the concept, then you are obliged to act in a certain way.
Well, I think Yukowski stepped in and basically just tried to squash it as quickly as possible because he saw how potent the anti-rational meme was, right? You wouldn't have to stop something that wasn't going to spread naturally. It would spread all too readily. And what's particularly interesting is that you have similar anti-rational meme constructs being rediscovered. So this is a very religious idea, right? It's not exactly Laplace's demon or what have you, but I think there. What's the Laplace thing where act as if God exists because if God doesn't exist.
Oh, Pascal's wager.
Thank you, Pascal's wager. Yeah. Sorry, I got confused. Yeah. So Pascal's wager. So this is just kind of a tweak on that. And so it isn't a coincidence that different religions all evolve very similar strategies. So I was like, one thing that I always try to do is like look to the language. So different religions will have different words for outsiders who are trying to corrupt. So you have like infidel or takfir in Islam. You have blasphemer, apostate. In wokeness, you have straight white men. They're just like, if you say that phrase, then you're not to be taken seriously. Your ideas don't matter anymore. You're an outsider. You don't count. Your thoughts are irrelevant because you're not part of our tribe. In Scientology, I guess there's suppressive person. And so different communities will evolve these kinds of terminology. I am willing to bet that at every MLM, every multi-level marketing, there's some term that the MLM comes up with to describe friends and family members who don't buy your business, who don't believe in the power of your business. And I bet you each one has a different terminology, but imagine stuff like doubters or business skeptics or just some label to attach to people who are trying to criticize you. And that label will continuously evolve new terms in different communities, but it's all the same effect. And the effect is to silence criticism. And so Roko's basilisk is interesting because it is very much just a religious idea, just kind of couched in slightly rationalist jargon. But the same kinds of anti-rational memes continuously emerge and evolve in exactly the same reason that different kinds of viruses emerge and evolve continuously. So you can keep coming up with new flu vaccines, but you're going to keep getting new flus, and you can keep coming up with new ways to call out this language, but you're going to keep getting new kinds of language. And so looking to the language, I think, is always a very valuable exercise because often the language is subtle enough that you don't notice it unless you stare at it directly.
All right, I have a couple other examples.
So we have 10 minutes. Yeah, we have 10 minutes. So hit me with one of them, and then let's try to knock out the e-fuels one and stick the landing. All
right. So yeah, I'll just mention these quickly. We don't have to go into it, but I think actually these are pretty good ones for audience to ponder. So maybe we won't even say that much about it. But so another one is divorce/monogamy. So I think there's often this idea that people who get divorced just didn't try hard enough for obviously there's some extreme cases, but I was definitely raised in a household where divorce was a bit of a dirty word, right? Like if you commit to marry someone, then you commit to marry them, and you make it through thick and thin, and you only divorce if you're of a weak moral fiber. So in some sense that's, and I think polygamy has a similar problem where it's like, if you're not monogamous, you're a fucking weirdo, right? Like, this is the norm, and you're just some freak who can't commit to a single person, et cetera, et cetera. So these are anti-rational and fairly straightforward ways. I don't think it's worth spelling out. The last one is sort of related to Roko's basilisk. It's Yudkowsky's argumentation style, which I haven't been able to fully pinpoint what's anti-rational about it. My spidey sense is tingling. So maybe let's not say anything, but I'll just leave it with the audience. Is he'll do this thing where he will refuse to posit. So he's been on multiple podcasts, and he'll refuse to posit an argument about why AI is going to take over the world. What he'll do instead is say, give me a counter argument.
Yeah, nice. Yeah,
and I will knock it down, right? So he's in some sense hiding in this weird, vague land where any concrete proposal, of course, it's about the future. So of course, there's some like way to knock it down if you just posit a powerful enough AI. And then he'll say, well, then by default, it's this thing is going to take over the world and kill everyone. And what I think he's actually doing is realizing that he has no strong argument to say. It would be embarrassing for him to say exactly how it's going to work, because then someone could poke a hole in that argument. So instead, he retreats to not having to do that. And he says, I'm going to poke holes in everyone else's argument. So it doesn't maybe quite fit the precise framework of anti-rational meme, but I think it's close. And if you listen to him, I think it's a useful lens to now listen to him.
Yeah.
And if you go listen to him on someone like the Lunar Society, you'll see it right away. He'll say, okay, I'm actually like, tell me why the world won't end, and I'll tell you why you're wrong. Which is fucking crazy, man.
Yeah, well, it also fits into the idea of studying like anti-thinkers and anti-heroes, right? I think it's very important to study these kind of rhetorical devices precisely because they're so challenging to figure out what's going wrong. Like all the people I listed mainly came from the left, because people on the far right, it's obvious what's wrong with their arguments and there's nothing interesting to say. But it's the left arguments in the political domain, or the Yudkowsky style arguments are the slippery ones. And those are the ones that are uniquely worth studying.
Okay, so Alexi, hopefully that was somewhat satisfying. All right, let's move on. Last question.
We got the last question, dude, and then we're finished our AUA for the next 10 years.
And we have 7 minutes and 30 seconds to answer it before we're kicked out of our Zencaster room, people. So excuse us if we're a little time crunched.
So this one is a amazing throwback to our environmental episodes. And this is a very straightforward question. What do you think about e-fuels? So this is from my buddy Lorcan. Shout out to Lorcan. So maybe set up this last question about e-fuels.
Okay, so Lorcan is wondering about e-fuels, and he basically he's wondering what we think about them. And he links a video that is critical, and he's sort of critical of the video. So I get the sense that he's on the pro e-fuel side. So just to back up for 1 second, what the hell is an e-fuel? So basically the idea here is to caption carbon from the atmosphere and then mix it with hydrogen.
Capture carbon. I think you said caption carbon. Caption, like write subtitles. Carbon. Write subtitles about
capture carbon from the atmosphere. Mix it with hydrogen to produce fuel. The idea is that, or the claim rather, is that when you burn it, right? So if you're running your car, you put e-fuels in your car. When you burn it, it's going to release carbon because it has carbon in it. But the idea is that, or the hope is that because you're using carbon from the atmosphere, it's going to release about the same amount of carbon as it consumes. So it's going to have a pretty low carbon footprint overall. Common e-fuels are like, you'll often just see the prefix E attached to it. So it'll be like e-kerosene, e-methane, or e-methanol. So there's various forms. You can mix various forms of carbon dioxide, monoxide, et cetera, with hydrogen. But that's the general idea.
Well, one tiny thing to add there. So the killer feature of e-fuels that solar panels and windmills don't have is that their promise is that they can be used with regular cars. So you don't need to change any of your cars. Exactly, so if you switch to battery or EV, you have to redesign all your new cars. But with e-fuels, the promise is that it can just be used with any existing car, and that's one of their big strengths.
And more than that, so not just with existing cars, but with the existing infrastructure used to pipe oil all over the country. Right.
Nice.
So now we could still have gas stations. We'd still have all the oil companies that we've laid a lot of pipeline across, for instance, North America. We could still use all that. We just replace the fossil fuels with e-fuels, right? And so in some sense, it seems like this great step where we can use existing infrastructure, use existing cars, get like a cleaner form of energy. And I think Lorcan's point is, why the fuck wouldn't we do this, right? Like, just because it doesn't require new infrastructure to build, just let gas stations start giving people e-fuels. There's no downside. And my claim is there actually is a downside. And so I happen to agree with the video, not Lorcan. I'm sorry, Lorcan. I appreciate you bringing this subject to our attention, but I do feel like I have to side with the video. And the basic reason is that it's one thing to say that it's more carbon neutral. That's definitely true because you're taking carbon from the atmosphere and then burning it, but they also require a lot more energy to produce. So the hydrogen, first of all, has to come from somewhere. And typically from electrolysis, right, where you separate hydrogen using electricity, that requires a lot of energy. And that energy, where's that going to come from, right? It can't be an infinite chain of e-fuels because it requires more energy input than output, than you get in output. So that energy has to come from somewhere. So it's not free. And that's energy you could be using to do other things. Then there's another argument about the infrastructure. So if you maintain the current infrastructure, we have no incentive to move to something like electric vehicles. And electric vehicles are, they're not perfect by any means, but they do get better with economies of scale, right? So the more electric vehicles you have on the road and the more not whatever the equivalent of gas stations is for electric vehicles, charging stations. The more efficient the whole network of electric cars are going to be. And so the more you maintain the current infrastructure, the more expensive electric vehicles are going to stay for everyone. And I think eventually we want to move towards something that is more electric. Obviously you're generating the electricity from somewhere. So it's not like electricity comes free, right? But it does seem like in the long run, we want to be somewhere closer to a portfolio with a higher percentage of electric vehicles than internal combustion engines, even if just for the fact that internal combustion engines are highly inefficient, right? So you feed stuff into an internal combustion engine. I think it's only about 30% efficient, whereas an electric vehicle is much higher than that, somewhere closer to 80%, I believe.
Yeah, no, I agree with all of that. I just want to add something and maybe tie back to some stuff we were saying earlier. I think that when you're presented with a new energy source, the first question, the most important question, the only question you need to ask at the beginning is just, what is its energy efficiency? And if the energy efficiency is low, meaning it requires a lot of energy put into it in order to get some energy out of it, then it's just a non-starter. And so it's example of perhaps being a bit distracted by facts that are irrelevant. So that's my first heuristic. The first thing I did when I researched this question is just, what is the energy efficiency? And so I'll cite a article on Forbes where they say the following. According to Transport and Environment, hydrogen fuel cells are currently 2.3 times less energy efficient than batteries, with the deficit dropping to 2 times less efficient by 2050. Synthetic fuels are less efficient still, with the estimate being about 4 times worse than batteries and projecting very little improvements by 2050. So in other words, powering the current car fleet with synthetic fuels instead of batteries would require 4 times as much electricity generation, which seems completely impractical. And that's all I needed to know to figure out if e-fuels are going to take off or not. And so that's just to to summarize and agree with everything you said. And we have exactly 1 minute left. So I think we can close and get on to other subjects. I feel like I've learned a lot about how you think throughout this AUA. This was great.
And not all of it's been good. All right.
But yeah, so I think this finally concludes our AUA. And we are doing Conjectures and Refutations series next. God damn it. Because I really want to get back to the meat of the matter. So, cool.
That's it, dude.
Talk to you soon. Bye.